Hi and welcome to the course. First and foremost, thank you for taking a risk on me as a new educator on this platform. I've tripled the amount of time I originally planned to put into the production of this course, and I hope that additional value shines through and gives you the best advantage possible. I want to give you an initial overview of what you can expect to learn from this course. We'll be gaining mastery over Photoshop's pen, lasso, and generative fill tools to seamlessly extract characters from their backgrounds. We'll also delve into the paintbrush and smudge tool to rebuild some of the elements too. You'll learn how to speed up your workflow with the use of hotkeys and how to import your Photoshop files into After Effects so you can begin the rigging process. I'll also show you how we can create depth maps and use those to animate background and foreground assets. When it comes to character animations, you'll learn how to bring them to life with code and keyframes, as well as taking advantage of shape path animations, masks, and a variety of effects. We'll make them blink, swing their sword, and I'll show you how to troubleshoot any errors along the way. You'll also get a look at how I grade and light my scenes, as well as how to use stock effects to bolster your compositions. I'll show you the best export settings, as well as showing you where you can pick up those additional 50 characters so you can start creating your own animation showreel. There's a lot more than that, but those are the basics. I'm very excited to share this journey with you, and with all of that, I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and thanks again for picking up the course. If you're at this section, you'll have installed Adobe Creative Cloud, and you'll be ready to make a start. From here, there are 3 sections to work through, one for each character, and then a final section with bonus content. I've built a bit of a learning curve into the 3 sections. The first one will be very descriptive and beginner-friendly. The second will introduce a couple more concepts and have less hand-holding, and then finally, the third will be assuming you've got a decent grasp of the workflow. So a lot of it is going to be time-lapsed at that point. You will have the visual reference of how I'm working, but you'll be leaning more heavily on the skills you've acquired from the first 2 characters. All that said, in this section, I'll be teaching you how to navigate Photoshop, before detailing how we separate the character from the background. We'll then split the character into separate layers and rebuild the background elements. I'll show you how to create depth maps in Photoshop so we can animate our background in After Effects. You'll also get a rundown of the rigging process and how to use the puppet pin tool to apply a mesh that can be animated later. You'll also learn a little bit about animating with code, as well as my go-to effects and lighting setup. I hope you're excited to make a start, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. Just a quick reminder, I'm going to be using Photoshop Beta with the Generative Fill function in this tutorial. So if Generative Fill isn't in the default Photoshop for you yet, you will need to use this beta version instead. We're going to set up a new project by clicking the New File button. And then in the width setting, we'll put 3840. And then in the height, 2160. Keep the resolution at 300. Make sure it's set to pixels. Also, make sure you have artboards turned off. And this should be set to pixels / inch. You can either leave the color mode at 8-bit or turn it to 16. If you turn it to 32, you won't be able to use Generative Fill, so just be careful with that. And then, when you're ready, click Create. So here's a quick rundown of where everything is. Most of the tools you'll be using are on this sidebar on the left. Above that, you have the menus. I won't go into all the details here because a lot of it will be irrelevant, but we will occasionally be navigating to some of these, so as long as you know where the menus are, we can continue. Back to the toolbar. If you hover over the icons, it'll reveal what they do. It's worth noting that if you hold the left mouse button down on an icon, it will reveal additional options within it. The reality is we'll likely only use a couple of these tools, the most frequent being the lasso, pen, and smudge tools. Finally, on the right, we have the layers section, which we'll be using to keep all of our assets organized. So your first challenge if you haven't downloaded the project file with the image already in it, is to find the Character 1 image and drag and drop it into Photoshop. Make sure the asset is flush with the page so there aren't any white gaps on the canvas, then click enter. There is just one more thing that I want us to do. You'll see in the layers panel, we now have a file called background. If you double click on that and then OK on this menu, we want to delete that using the delete key, or you can click the little bin in the bottom corner. This is just so when we come to export the character layers later down the line, we don't accidentally export with this white background as well. When we get the PNG exports, we'll want them to be completely transparent. And you can often forget about this white layer when you go to do that, so it's best to get rid of it now. Let's get this saved by going to the menu and hovering over File, and then Save As. And then let's put this in our Character 1 asset folder. Just make sure the save type is Photoshop PSD. There we go, a nice and simple one for you to start. Now that you know where everything is, we'll be able to start breaking our character into layers so they can be animated. So if you're ready for that, join me in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this section, we'll begin to separate the character from the background. But before that, we need to investigate something in the layer panel. When you brought the image in, it'll be labeled as a smart object. A smart object will retain quality when you scale it up or down, but they can't be edited easily. Luckily for us, there's a way of changing a smart object to a rasterized image. And you do that by right-clicking on the layer and then moving over to Rasterize Layer. If we wanted to turn it back into a smart object, which we always should do when we're adjusting the scale, you right-click again and then go to Convert to Smart Object. You can have even more control over how your image scales. And I want to show you how we do that. So I'm going to head over to the menu, hovering over Edit, and then going to Preferences and then General. You'll see a drop-down called Image Interpolation that has a couple of options. Some are good for downscaling, while others are better for upscaling. But for the time being, let's keep it on automatic. I'm going to turn this smart object layer back into a rasterized image. With all that said, it's time to start cutting out this character, and we're going to do that with the pen tool. I'll be using shortcuts a lot in this. The shortcut for the pen tool is P. We'll be moving around the canvas a lot as well. You can move the canvas up and down with your middle mouse button's scroll functionality. If you hold down Alt and scroll, you'll be able to zoom in and out of your image as well. And if you wanted to move side to side, you could do so by holding down the Control key and then using your middle mouse button to scroll again. You can also drag yourself around the canvas, which I tend to do quite a lot. You can do this by selecting the hand tool and the shortcut is H. And this allows you to drag yourself around the canvas when you hold the left mouse button. You can use this with a combination of the scroll wheel to zoom in closer to the image. You'll find that you're constantly switching between the pen tool and the hand tool, so really nail down those hotkeys, which again are P for the pen and H for the hand. We'll start by getting as close as possible to where the edge of the character meets the edge of the canvas. We'll left click to leave a vector, and we'll begin drawing the line which we'll use to cut out our character. Now, we need to keep closer to the inside of the line rather than outside of it. And you'll notice that when you left click to leave your second vector point with the mouse button held still, you'll get this line. And if you drag it about, it'll bend the line. Your aim with the pen tool is to get your vector curve to match the curvature of the outline. And you do that by holding and pulling the second vector point. Once you have the curve in the right place, you then hold the Alt key. This will stop the line from bending but give you control of the trajectory of the next anchor point you will place. You should point that in the direction that you plan to move. Once you're happy with that, let go of the mouse button to solidify the vector's position. We're now going to start going up the side of the character's body. We've reached the point where the curve changes dramatically. you can actually hold down Alt and then left click on the trajectory line to drag it to a new direction, even after it's placed. I'm just going to make it smaller here so the curve is less drastic. I'll continue on up around the belt and the torso. Throughout the course, I'll be speeding the footage up until key moments arise. I encourage you to pause the video when you do need to cross-reference your work against my own. Don't feel like you have to rush through this process. Take your time and don't be put off by how quick I seem to be going. It is just the magic of video editing. And don't worry, I'll always slow the footage back down for any key moments that need a little more insight. Occasionally zooming out to get a better understanding of the image as a whole. Zooming back in to continue on the cape. And then onto the sword. Now, I'll be honest, cutting out all of these pieces is the longest part. Once you're comfortable with the pen tool, you'll eventually end up in a sort of autopilot where you can listen to music or put on a podcast. You will have to make some creative decisions as part of this process, but it is essentially just a labour-intensive part of the process. It's alright though, just take your time, you'll gain more confidence and become faster the further along you go. If you do drop a point down and it's wrong, you can always click Ctrl and Z to delete the last vector as well. At the edge of the canvas, we'll just place a vector on the grey section, then over to the other side of the sword. And those are the basics for the pen tool. Throughout the rest of this video, I'll be speeding it up and slowing it down to any key moments where I can elaborate on my decision making. I'll cut along the sword, don't worry about these leaves, we'll cut that into its own layer, a foreground layer at a later stage. We just want to focus primarily on the character for the time being. Now, at this section where the sword meets the cape, I've overshot where I needed to leave the vector point. So I'm zooming out to get a better understanding of the image before zooming back in, hitting Ctrl and Z to go back to the previous vector, and then I'm placing the new vector in the right place to start moving up the side of the character's cape. As I'm moving around the character's elbow, I actually make a mistake here, where I cut along the outline of the background instead of the arm. It turns out I was right in my first attempt, but this little error snuck through to the final piece. So here's your chance to one-up me already. Let's see if you can cut out the elbow properly. Now, I'm continuing up these shoulder pieces and then to the head. Again, it's a slow process. You do need a degree of patience in order to do this properly. With these sections of the course where I am just cutting and speeding up the footage, I fully recommend putting some music on in the background, preferably something without lyrics, if you don't fancy sitting through the silence. And if you're struggling for choice for music, I have a lo-fi playlist on my YouTube page. Then I'm tackling the other shoulder. The arm. And then the cape. Finally, down this side of the torso and off the canvas. Then, you simply link the last vector with the first. Once it's all connected, right-click on the canvas and navigate down to Make Selection. We don't want any feathering, so make sure that that's set to 0, and you'll now see that the character is highlighted. We're going to copy the character selection with Ctrl and C, then we'll head up to the menu and go to Select, then Modify, and then Expand. We'll expand our selection by a couple of pixels, hit OK, and then we're going to delete the character from the background. Now, the reason we just used the Expand tool was to make sure we've deleted any leftover outline of the character that would still be on the background layer. Then finally, we'll hold Ctrl and Shift and V to paste our character back in place. If you just use Ctrl and V, you would paste the character, but they might end up in a different place than where we'd cut from. You'll then see a new layer appear in the layer panel. You can toggle the layers on and off with a little eye for visibility, and you can also rename the layers by double-clicking on its name. And that's it for this section of the tutorial. When you're ready, join me in the next part, where we'll be cutting out the foreground elements as well. Just a reminder, I have my project files that run parallel available to download for anyone who wants to cross-reference their work with my own at each relevant stage for this course. In this section, we'll be cutting out the foreground parts of the image. It's going to be more of the same from the last section, so you'll be honing your mastery of the pen tool. You'll be making a lot of creative decisions during this process in terms of what you actually want to take into the foreground. For instance, this slightly more grayed out leaf here, that's staying in the background as I'm opting to grab these darker leaves instead. Again, I'll be speeding up parts of the video, so if it looks like I'm going inhumanly fast, know that I'm not. There will be a bunch of wonky elements within these designs that we will fix later, but for the time being, we're just going to focus on cutting out the base assets. You don't have to cut everything out exactly the same way that I am. It really is a bit of a grind to chop out things with the pen tool. There are other ways of cutting images out, which I will get into when we get to our second character animation. But for the time being, I want to get you used to using the pen tool, as it's still the most accurate way of cutting out images. I encourage you to make your own creative decisions in this process. But we are going to come into a lot of janky parts of the image. But again, don't worry, we're going to fix those later. This section in particular, I'll be coming back to fill in the leaf in a later video. And we'll just continue up here. It is very easy to get lost within this. Again, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. You don't need to get every single element. I'm missing out this section underneath me here, because it doesn't make visual sense to me. Continuing to get the very top. And then the final sections at the very top. Once it's all connected, we're going to repeat the same process as the last video. Right-clicking on the canvas, going to Make Selection, and then hitting Ctrl+C. The only other thing to mention is that we should have our background layer selected in the Layers panel, not the character layer. Otherwise, you'll run into issues like I just did. Then head up to the top menu and then select Modify, and then Expand. Increase the pixel size a couple of pixels and click OK, and then we're going to delete that section. Use Ctrl-Shift and V to paste it back into the right position. We'll call this layer Foreground L for foreground left, and we'll make a start on the right side. Again, I'm going to let this run sped up so you can see the decisions I'm making with the pen tool. As you practice with the pen tool, you'll become much more fluent with it. You'll start to understand how far the points can be pulled to get the right curve. Again, for these drastic bends, where you need a sharp line back in towards itself, just Alt-click the lever coming off the vector and drag it back in the direction that you want it to head in. If you find yourself getting lost in the composition close up, zoom out, recompose yourself, and then zoom back in once you've got the clarification on the direction you need to take. Once everything is connected, we're going to repeat the same process again. Right-click the canvas, go to Make Selection, and hit OK. I'm making sure as well that our background layer is selected. I'm going to copy that pixel data. Then before doing anything else, we're going to go to the top menu, select, modify, expand. You'll know the rest by now. We're going to delete the right foreground. And because we copied the pixel data from earlier, we can now paste it back into our composition using Ctrl, Shift, and V. And then finally, we will rename that layer to Foreground R. And that's it for this section. In the next video, I'll be showing you how to use Adobe's new Generative Fill to replace the missing parts of the background. I'll see you then. Welcome back. In this part of the course, we'll be replacing the missing parts of the background using Adobe's new Generative Fill. Before Generative Fill existed, I used to use Content Aware Fill, which would pull pixel information from the rest of the image to fill the empty space. Generative Fill is doing something similar, but I'm finding it gets better looking results. So we'll go over to our lasso tool, or click L to bring it up if you remembered the hotkey. And we're going to start drawing around the empty space that we have on the right side of our image. We'll go off the canvas and around to link it. Now, I'm going to show you the old method in the past. With this selected, you'd right-click and then go to Content Aware Fill. The green that you see on the screen is Photoshop taking pixel information from those parts, and through the power of technology, which is a little beyond me, I've got to say, is attempting to make a texture in the previously empty space, which matches the general vibe of the rest of the image. You'll see it's tried its best. But we can actually get better quality from this. So I'm going to use Ctrl+Z and then head down to Generative Fill down on this hotbar. Now, when you click this, it gives you the option to type in some details. We're actually going to leave this blank and just click Generate. We'll wait, and then after a couple of seconds, it'll give us some Generative Fill options to choose from. On the hotbar, you'll see it says 1 out of 3. You can click through them to see the options. It's very smart already for a fairly new piece of technology. Some of the results are going to be better than others. If you wanted, you could click Generate again to get even more options. But I'm going to choose this one. I like what it's done for the door. Finally, I'll head over to the Layer panel, click on the 2 layers with Shift held down to select them both, and I'll right-click and turn them both into one single smart object. Once they're one single object, I will right-click again and rasterize them. Then I'll go back in and lasso this section on the bottom right and repeat the process. I'm going to cycle through my options here. Number 3 is good enough for me, so I'll repeat that process of merging the layers together. And then we'll make a start on the right part of the image using the lasso tool to highlight the empty part of the canvas. Then, using Generative Fill again. I've been using diffusion technology for a while now, and it still blows my mind that this is even possible. So I'm going to check through my options here and just find the best one that doesn't look out of place. Let's merge those layers together and then get to work on the middle section of the background. You know the drill by now, going around the empty space with the lasso tool and then using Generative Fill. Again, just checking through my options. Most of it's going to be hidden by the character anyway. I'm happy with that, so I'm going to merge my layers. Right-click, convert to Smart Object, and then right-click again and rasterize the layers. I'm going to clean up a couple of the smaller parts of the image the same way, really just trying to find something that blends with the rest of the background here. I'm going to merge my layers again. And then I'll tidy up the layers panel by naming everything appropriately. As you'll find later in the course, you will have a lot of layers, so it becomes very important to name things in a way where you'll be able to find them later. We'll just merge these layers together so we have a complete background, and there you go. When we animate our character in foreground, we won't have any blank parts of the canvas showing through. We still have some tidying up of the foreground elements left to do, so meet me in the next video and I'll show you exactly how we do that. Welcome back. In this section of the course, I'll show you how we can fix elements of the foreground. First of all, let's isolate both foreground elements by turning off the character and background layers. And we'll start with the left-hand side. I'll be using a mixture of the pen tool and lasso tool, which you should be very familiar with now. The aim is to cut out the gaps between the leaves. The pen tool will always give you more precision, and I tend to default back to it. But the more you use the lasso tool, the better you'll get, and then you can work a lot quicker. I typically find that the cutting out stage is the longest part of the whole process. But it also allows you to fix any inconsistencies with the artwork as you move towards the animation stage. For instance, with this broken branch, I don't currently think it makes a great deal of sense in this composition. So using the lasso tool, I'm going to make a selection to turn this into a bigger leaf, and then use Generative Fill to fix it. Just remember to merge your layers anytime you do use a Generative Fill. We'll continue to work on the lower section as well. In some instances, it actually makes more sense to fill than to cut. There are instances where you can use the smudge tool. If you can't currently see this, head over to your toolbar and hold down the left mouse button on either the blur tool or sharpen tool. That will be there in its place. This works similar to the paintbrush, but instead of laying down a new colour, it'll allow you to drag colour from the point clicked towards the direction you lead your cursor. I'll be using this tool often throughout the course. We'll continue to use the pen tool to cut out the gaps. This leaf isn't connected to the rest of the plant, but it's easy enough to fix. I'm going to use the lasso tool to create a selection area between them. I could use Generative Fill, but instead I'm going to paint it in. If we go over to our colour picker in our toolbar, we can then move our cursor over the leaf and left click to grab that colour. We can click OK, and then using the hotkey B, we can bring up our brush. If you go up near the menu next to the little house icon, in here you'll find a bunch of different brush types, and you'll have the option to scale the brush up in size and down in size too. The brush type isn't particularly important, just make sure it's big enough to fill the selected space, and then simply paint that in. You can finesse it slightly with the smudge tool so it blends a little nicer. We're going to repeat that same process on this next leaf. There are a dozen ways to do the same thing in Photoshop. It's nice to switch it up a bit, just to keep yourself sane. We'll keep chopping out the empty space and fixing inconsistencies as we go, utilising the techniques that I've shown you so far. Now, I'm sure you'll be able to handle the other side on your own, but I leave a time-lapse running of how I've tackled it in case you run into any issues and want to cross-reference my work. And just in case you're wondering how long I actually spent on this without speeding everything up, it took me around about an hour and a half just to tidy up the foreground. So don't be fooled by Premiere Pro. There will be moments where you'll have to make some creative decisions when cutting. This little section here with the yellow section of the leaf doesn't make sense to me, so I'm going to cut it in a way where it looks like it has more of a natural tip. If you're lucky, when you collaborate with artists purely as an animator, They may have worked on their characters with layers in mind. The illustrators who do this are a godsend, as it makes your life as an animator so much easier. But sometimes you don't always get that. So it's good to know how to cut things out yourself. I did consider throwing some music on this video myself for the long silent parts, but I'm aware some people would rather just listen to their own playlists, and I do encourage you to do so. But again, if it's taking you a long time, do not worry. I have a tendency to put a lot of pressure on myself to get things done quickly, but sometimes it is just a matter of taking your time and slowly figuring stuff out. I've discovered that my own personality type tends to lack patience, so this kind of work is very challenging for me. But in a world of social media and dopamine at the press of a button, it's worthwhile trying to strike a balance and force yourself to challenge these negative traits that you might have. And after all of that, we have our background sections organised and ready to go. Congratulations on making it this far. I'll be honest, it can be a real test of willpower. When you're in a flow state with it, it can feel more like a meditation once you're proficient enough with the workflow and can do it on autopilot. But until that point, it's natural to get a bit frustrated. When you've built enough confidence and you're doing this type of work yourself, I really do recommend putting on some music or listening to a podcast. But all that aside, I promise we'll get into the more interesting parts, starting in the next video, where we'll be breaking our character up into separate layers. I'll see you then. Hi and welcome back. Just another reminder that you can access my project files at each stage of the course in case you want to cross-reference your own work with mine. Again, well done if you've made it this far. This section focuses on splitting our assassin into multiple layers so we can animate him in After Effects. First, let's turn off the background and foreground layers. The first job we have is cutting out the hood. We'll look for any natural seams in the design. So I'm going to place my vectors along here. We'll use the pen tool to cut down towards the arm. We've got to be careful though, this bit is a little bit confusing, so instead I'll cut towards the hair. And then I'll head up above the face, and then down around the eye, until we reach the other side. And then we're going to head north, we'll loop it back around to the starting point, right click, and then go to Make Selection. We're not going to expand the mask this time, so just click Ctrl and C, delete, and then Ctrl Shift plus V. And we'll name this layer Character 1 Hood. We're going to continue this process, this time separating the head and the hair from the rest of the image. So let's zoom back in and we'll begin cutting around the arm again, and then going back up around the hair. Just taking our time to make sure that we get it as accurate as possible. We'll keep the neck in this layer as well. Again, just taking our time, making sure we get it right. And then down the hair. And once we have that all selected, click Ctrl and C to copy, delete this section from the rest of the layer, and then Ctrl plus Shift plus V to paste it back in its proper place. And we'll name this layer Character 1 Head. When it comes to the animation process, we'll have control over how the hood moves over the face. Next, we'll tackle the character's right arm. We'll start by cutting under the shoulder piece, along the top of the arm, into the empty space, before cutting back in around the wrist, and then down to the hand. We're going to get this sword with this layer as well. Along the edge of the sword, then back around. Heading back towards the hilt, and then we arrive at the hand. We'll navigate around the fingers until we get to the sword's hilt. Being as accurate as we can be, and then the rest of the arm. No need to rush, just take your time, and then we'll move on to the rest of the arm. Again, if you do overshoot the mark, you can always go back. Just Ctrl Z and then place your new anchor point in the right place. You know the drill by now. Right click, make selection, hit OK. Ctrl plus C to copy, delete the selection, and then Ctrl Shift and V to paste it in its own layer. And we'll name that layer Character 1 Arm. And we'll do the same for the character's left arm, starting around the shoulder and just cutting our way around. This bit on the hand is a little bit tricky. I'm going to cut into it a little further than suggested there. We want to grab the other sword as well. And don't worry, I'll be showing you how to rebuild these layers so there isn't all this empty space. But for the time being, let's keep cutting around the sword. And we'll head back up to the hilt. Then around the rest of the arm, we'll get this little leather strap as well. Just go back there until we link back to our first vector. We'll separate it in the same way we've done the others by making a selection, copying, deleting, and then Ctrl Shift and V to paste it back in place on its own layer. And we'll name it Character 1 L Arm. Now, the canvas is starting to look pretty abstract. Don't worry about it. If it looks a mess, that means you're doing everything right. Let's grab this right shoulder piece with the lasso tool and separate that onto its own layer. Again, Ctrl C, delete, and Ctrl Shift and V. We'll call that Character 1 R Shoulder. Let's do the same for the right section of the cape. You know the drill by now. make that selection, Control C, delete it, Control Shift and V to put it on its own layer. And I'll call that Character 1 R Cape. And then again, the same methodology for the left side of the cape. We'll rebuild this so it does look more like a cape rather than an abstract piece of art. You will be a master at this now, knowing exactly what you have to do. And we'll call that Character 1 L Cape. And if you hate my naming conventions, feel free to use your own. I'm going with the characters left and right instead of our own perceived left and right. If you do change it to be the other way, I won't hold it against you. Okay, and with that settled, let's isolate the left shoulder. And then I've named it Character 1 L Shoulder. Next, I'm going to grab the scarf. And again, you've mastered this technique now, if you can call it a technique. Say this part of the process. All you need to do is call it Character 1 Scarf. That's the bulk of the actual separation done. Now, we're actually going to rebuild the layers, starting with the body. I'm going to use the pen tool to outline where I'd like the torso to sit, making sure that it sits slightly further up than the shoulders. Bringing it all the way around. We'll make that a selection, and then we'll use our new favorite tool, Generative Fill, to see what we get. Let's wait for Photoshop to do its magic. Again, it doesn't really need to be perfect. We're not going to see the whole torso as the arms are going to be in front of it. We just want the gaps to be filled well enough that we have more flexibility to animate when it comes to After Effects. Just having a look at the options. I'm happy with this one. Grab both of those layers in the layer panel with Shift-click, right-click them, convert them to a smart object. I'm going to move the cape layer so it sits underneath the body layer. I'm going to use the pen tool to outline this spiked shape, connecting it to the rest of the cape. I did not mean for that to rhyme. This layer is going to sit beneath the torso, so I'd like it to overlap on the inside. We'll make the selection and use Generative Fill. And then we'll cycle through the options. Just zooming out to get a better look. This one will do, but I'm going to modify it. I'm not liking how unnatural this section looks. We'll tackle that in a moment. And with all our generative fills, let's just grab both the layers, right-click, convert to smart object, and then rasterize them afterwards. We'll sort the easier aspects first, like cutting these holes into the fabric. I'll do a quick and loose job with the lasso tool. And then for this section, I'm just going to content-aware fill it so it blends better. Grab both of those layers, right-click on them, and convert them to a smart object, and then rasterize them afterwards. And then on this odd-looking section, I'm going to use the lasso tool again, just to tweak it slightly. I'll see if content-aware fill yields any quick solutions. Nah, it doesn't look like it. Let's try generative fill instead. It flows more with this one, but it still looks a bit odd. There we go. I'm just moving the sword around to get a better look to see if there's an issue still. And then after that, you know what you need to do in the layers panel. I'm going to make a bigger selection around this grey part. And I'll take another look at content-aware fill. That looks like a solid improvement to me. Just remember to merge your layers in the layer panel. It's really easy to lose track of that. It's still not perfect, so I'm just going to try and blend it a little bit with the smudge tool. I'm just testing to see how much attention that section's going to actually have when the sword is moving around near it. And you know what? I think it's going to be fine. Just finessing it a little bit more. I don't want any harsh lines here. Then moving the sword around again, I think we'll get away with that. I just want to make sure that the cape does go far enough under the torso that there aren't any gaps, so I'll use the smudge tool here again. And then a bit of the brush tool here as well. I'm going to modify the next side of the cape now, using the lasso tool and content-aware fill to extend it. Let's merge the layers and then start cutting out these tears in the fabric. And I'll just amend this layer so it doesn't say copy in its name. We'll get back to chopping out these little tears in the fabric with the lasso tool. For this precise little piece, I'll switch back to the pen tool. Let's content-aware fill this section. I don't want any rips in the fabric here. And then that's the second piece of the cape done. Again, just keeping our layer panel nice and tidy, merging the relevant layers, and then naming them properly as well. Again, with this cape layer, I'm going to move that below the body. I want a little more control over the hand and the sword, so I'm going to split that from the rest of the arm. We'll use the pen tool to cut it out. Now, the hand is going to sit under the arm as a layer, so I'm just having a bit of a think about how best to separate it. There we go. I'll split it onto its own layer, and then I'll call that layer Character 1 R hand/sword, and I'll move it so it's below the Character 1 R arm. I'll have the pivot point on the wrist when it comes to the animation so I can get a little bit of rotation there. Let's fill in this part of the wrist so it goes under the arm, using a mixture of content-aware fill and the smudge tool. It doesn't need too much additional pixel information here, as it will sit under the arm. I just want a very subtle rotation there, and no gaps to be left. Now, this will be the toughest part to do. We're going to try and rebuild the sword and the hand. For the sword, we simply want to fill in the gap between the blade and the hilt using the pen tool. And then generative fill the rest of it. The other sword is going to sit over it, so we don't need the most amount of detail. We just want it to match the general vibe. At the most basic level of this, we don't need to paint over the images. That's not to say we shouldn't learn, and I'd argue it's worth doing if you want to progress your skills. The AI features are amazing, but if you're traditionally skilled as well, you'll give yourself plenty more options and you'll be able to add a lot more detail than I'm showing you right now. We'll tidy up our layer panel. Typically, the top layer carries over the name when you turn it into a smart object. Afterwards, I'll rasterize it. For the time being, we are going to have to do a little bit of work to rebuild the hand. So first, let's lasso in a shape for where we want the finger to be placed. I'm going to strategically use the smudge tool to bring this down. Now, creativity is just problem solving. And the problem we've got to solve is, how do we create these other fingers? One way is to take an existing part of the image and to tweak it. See this ridge? We're going to grab this whole finger. We'll copy the layer and move it down to the next one. Make sure it's a smart object, making sure it's above the previous layer so it sits on top. Then with the layer selected, hold Ctrl and T to highlight it to bring up this blue square. If you right-click in the blue square, it'll give you a bunch of options, and if you scroll down, you'll see one that says Warp. Click on that. We are going to deform this finger so it's slightly different from the last one, and also so it sits a little nicer on the hand. Warp allows you to drag the image around from the intersecting vector points, and when you're done, just hit Enter on your keyboard to close the warp. And we're going to repeat this process with the other fingers. I'm just going to copy and paste the layer, warp it slightly again, and then we're going to do that one final time for the last finger. Just pulling on the grid to get a shape that feels natural. There is a slight bit of blur, so I'm just going to use the lasso tool to draw a boundary line, and then I'm going to smudge into it so I've got a solid colour. Make sure that you've merged all of those layers together in the layer panel. And just seeing if it looks alright, I think we get away with it. I'm going to recreate the palm of the hand under here by creating another layer under the finger and filling it with a slightly darker hue than the finger itself. I'll move that new palm layer underneath the hand, and I'm just going to tidy up my naming conventions in the layer panel again. And there we go. One of the most challenging aspects is sorted. Next, let's fix the hair. It's a similar methodology to the cape from earlier. We draw these spike shapes in, paint and then smudge. It'll end up falling beneath the arm. I'm just going to do this point on the other side. Whilst we're up here, I'm going to separate the neck from the head. That sounds quite barbaric, I promise you it isn't. And then I'm going to use the pen tool to extend it, and I'm just going to content aware fill that. Let's create more of a head shape for our character. We don't need too much additional pixel information here, as the HUD will cover it. Let's use Generative Fill. And you know what? If it looks kind of demonic, you're actually on the right path. It's supposed to look like a Lovecraftian horror at this point, if I'm honest. I'm going to merge those layers and just rename it to keep things tidy. Even though we're not going to see it, I'm going to get rid of the eye because, to be fair, it's creeping me out. We're going one step further. We're separating the head and the hair. Just taking my time to get this as accurate as possible. Put that onto its own layer, and I'm going to name that Character 1 Hair. We'll fill this section of the face in, just using the pen tool to fill in the gaps. And I'll use Content Aware Fill and clean up any glaring errors like this exaggerated eyebrow. Just using Content Aware Fill to fix these little gaps. I'll combine those layers, make them a smart object. And there we go. As you can see with this example, we can get a little bit of movement on the hair now as well. The final thing that I'm going to show you with the character's face is a quick and easy way of getting our character to blink. I'm just going to rasterize the head layer. For this, we'll need to separate the eye from the head, which sounds pretty barbaric, but I promise you it's not. And then we'll use the eye asset itself to create a half-closed version of the eye and then one of a completely closed eye. I'll call this eye Character 1 Eye Open. And I'm just going to highlight the eyelid. I'm going to copy that and paste it into its own layer and call it Character 1 Eye Closed. I'll right-click on the layer and make it a smart object, and then back on the canvas, I'll flip it 180 degrees so it's upside down. To do that, with the layer selected, click Ctrl and T, and then go to the top corners, and you hover just outside the vector, and your cursor will change. Then when you left-click, you can spin this object around. Now, duplicate the open eye. You can do that by right-clicking on the layer and scrolling up to duplicate. In the little text window, we'll call it Character 1 Eye Mid. In order to make the middle pose for the eye, we're just going to warp the open eye so it's halfway to closed. So with the duplicated layer selected, which would be the mid eye, warp it with Ctrl and T, and slowly bring these vector points closer together. Just reposition it slightly. And there you go. That's how we get him to blink. Finally, let's fix the gap around the neck. We'll select our Character 1 body, rasterize the layer, and we're just going to content-aware fill this little section. Let's do a bit of tidying in the layer panel, just making sure everything's named properly. And that is the character fully prepared and ready to go for animation. Just make sure you get the file saved and join me in the next video where I'll show you quickly how we can make a depth map of our background layer, which will allow us to do some parallax animation in After Effects. I'll see you then. Hi and welcome back. This is our last step before going into After Effects to begin the animation process. We'll be creating a depth map, which we'll be able to use to create a parallax background effect. So, nice and simple, with your background layer selected, head over to the menu at the top, over to Filter, and then Neural Filters. It'll bring up this new section on the right-hand side. And as it'll be your first time using this, you'll need to download it. Don't worry though, it shouldn't take too long. I'm going to point you back to that helpful list whilst waiting for things to download. You don't have to do any of it really, I just thought it was quite funny. But there we go. Once it's loaded, you want to head over to this little Output Depth Map Only button, and I'll make this black and white gradient. Hit OK on that. I'm going to name this layer Character 1 Depth Map. Get it saved, and that is everything. In the next video, we're finally gonna get this guy moving. Hi and welcome back. It's time to actually animate something, which I'm sure is the core reason you picked up this course in the first place. I'm going to remind you again that with each section of this course, I'll have my project files at the ready for you in case you need to cross-reference my work against your own. But all of that aside, I'll show you how I go about setting up my project file. If you right-click in this project panel, you can create a new folder. I'm going to make the following: a sequence folder. The second folder will be for our assets. We'll have a character folder, which I'll drag into the assets folder. If you wanted to, you could create your folders by going to the folder icon at the bottom of the project panel. I'll make an extras folder for any stock assets I want to use. And then finally, a background folder, which I'll drag into the assets folder as well. Now, the quickest way to import these assets is to drag your PSD file, which is the Photoshop file you've been working on, into the After Effects project panel. Make sure the drop-down at the top is set to composition and that you have the Merge Layer Styles into Footage toggle ticked before you hit OK. It'll create a new sequence which you can drag into your sequence folder. I'm going to find our background and foreground elements and put them in this folder as well. I'm going to move all of my character layers into the right folder. You can shift-click and grab multiple objects or hold Control down as you click through and select multiple assets. I'm going to move all of my character assets into the right folder. I'm going to take my depth map and the background layers into the background folder. Then I'll delete the imported folder as well. I'm going to double-click on our sequence to open it in the timeline, and then right-click on the sequence file and click on the composition settings. I just want to make sure that I've got this set to 24 frames per second. The resolution size should already match the canvas size of our Photoshop file. Hey, it's Future James here. I forgot to mention in the original recording that our composition should be 10 seconds long. Now, if you've got your timeline set up in the frame per second view, you would just need to put 240 into the duration. If your composition settings look a little bit different to mine, that's okay. Let's just OK out of this. And if we head over here to the bottom left and Control-click on these numbers, it will give us an alternative display style. Now, if we go back up to our sequence, right-click and go to Composition Settings, you'll now see there's a different format from before. In here, you just want to set it up with 10 seconds like I've demonstrated. And finally, if you're a little worried that your computer might not be able to handle 4K compositions, we can actually turn this into a 1080p composition instead. In order to do that, we would change the width to 1920 and the height to 1080. All of your assets will be too large now though, and we're going to have to shrink them. And in order to do that, we'd want to click the very top layer, go to the second to bottom file, and whilst holding Shift, left click it so everything gets selected. Now next to the furthest drop down along on any of the selected items, you'll see this little snail. If you left click and drag over to the background layer on the bottom and then let go, all of those layers will now be attached. Now if you hit S on your keyboard, you'll bring up the scale options. And if you click on the number 100 and simply enter 50, it will shrink everything back to scale. And then finally, left click on the file above, scroll all the way back to the top, shift and left click, and then go to the furthest drop down menu on any of the selected items and set it to none. And then we can continue. If this is your first time in After Effects, this lower section on the left is essentially your layers panel, like in Photoshop, but on the other side of the software. Next to this on the right is the timeline. You can select a single layer at a time by left-clicking. If you shift-click, you can grab multiple layers across the whole spectrum. Or you can hold Control and then click to grab specific layers at the same time. In order to stay organized, I color-code groups together. So with the two foreground elements selected, I can click this little purple box beside them and change the color. And it'll affect both. It's quite easy to get lost with all the layers. So organization is key to prevent any future headaches. I'll make the background and the depth map the same color. You can toggle the layers on and off with the little I button. If you do need to change the name of a layer, you can do so by clicking and holding on the text for a moment. The file menu at the top will allow you to save and export. And for the time being, that's all you need to know. So let's start organizing our layers. I'll make the cape layer cyan. The body can be green. The scarf, neck and head can be peach. I'll set the left arm to fuchsia. The right arm to aqua. The eyes can be yellow. And the hair and the hood can be orange. The setting up of the project really is the most time-consuming part. It's just a part of the process, I'm afraid. But there is one more key part of the setup before we can start dropping keyframes onto our timeline, and that is rigging our character. So join me in the next video and we'll get to it. Welcome back. You're only one video away from animating this assassin. What a wild ride it has been so far. I am sorry it's taking so long to get to the actual animation, but fortunately this is just the process, so if you stick with it, it will be worth it, I promise you. In this video, in order to get to that final section, we just need to power through the rigging, so let me show you how we do that in this video. Well, first of all, what is rigging, I hear you ask? Why, it's how we link all the layers together, so when one layer moves, it makes sense in context with the rest of them. You might be familiar with tools like Duik or Blender, where you attach a skeleton to your character. I'm not going to teach you any of that, because there's a simple, beginner-friendly way to do something similar in After Effects without any third-party plugins. And that's simply by using the Pick Whip tool, along with the clever positioning of the Anchor Point tool. But before we get into that, I'm going to cover the basics of moving around the canvas in After Effects. You can zoom in and out with the scroll wheel. You can also click the hotkey H to switch your cursor to the hand tool, which you can use to drag yourself around. Your toolbar in After Effects sits under the menu. You'll see the little blue hand up there too. When you want to convert back to your cursor, you can do so by clicking V. You'll be swapping between H and V a lot, so it's integral that you nail those shortcuts down. Now, the final tool that we'll be using in this video is the Anchor Point tool, which you can bring up with Y. Why is the Anchor Point tool Y? I have no idea, but if you ask yourself that question when you need it, you'll never forget it. Again, all of those tools are accessible from the toolbar at the top. So with the cursor tool selected, which is V, go down to your character's body layer and select it. Then change to the Anchor Point tool. Why am I doing that? Well, because we want to move the pivot point to a more appropriate spot of the body. The core will serve as our foundation that all our other layers will feed into. Let's use this right cape as an example. I'm going to drag the anchor point over to where the cape meets the torso. Now, I might want to animate these two sections individually. I could have split them up in Photoshop, but there's a way that I can do that in After Effects as well. So on my cape layer, I'm going to select it. You might have to click V to turn back to the cursor tool if you haven't already. And then I'm going to click Ctrl and C, Ctrl and V to paste it. Then I'm going to have this second section anchored a little lower, and I'm going to use the pen tool to create a mask. First, I'll solo the layer by clicking this little dot next to the eye. It's quite difficult to make out the cape from the background due to it being a darker colour, so I'll navigate over to the toolbar underneath the canvas and I'll click on the toggle for the transparency grid. And there we go. We can actually see what we're doing now. If we go to the top toolbar, we can click on the pen tool, which confusingly is G in After Effects. G for guess this is the pen tool instead of P. I have no idea. And we're going to make a selection not too dissimilar to how we'd drawn the one in Photoshop. It's very familiar, right? And now you can see that we have successfully created a mask. We're going to do a similar thing with a duplicated layer, but for the lower half. And there we go. With that done, let's save and continue. Let's move the anchor point of the other cape. Now I'm going to shift click and grab all these cape layers and attach them to the body layer. And I can do that by dragging from this little snail looking dude. Just drag it over to the body layer and then let go of the mouse button. Now, if you move the body, the cape layers will follow. Let's move the anchor point for the scarf. And then connect that to the body as well. Let's repeat the process for the left shoulder piece. Again, using the pick whip to attach it to the body afterwards. We'll do the same for the right shoulder piece. Now for the left arm. Let's pick whip that to the left shoulder. And we want to move the anchor point to the point of natural rotation. So we'll place that over at the elbow. Now when I rotate this arm, you'll see it moves from a place that makes sense. We're not at the animation stage just yet, but if you're curious on how I'm doing that, with a layer selected, you can use the hotkey R to bring up the rotation settings in the layer panel. Then by dragging this section left and right, you can rotate it. Once you're done playing around with that, set it back to 0, and then let's move on. To minimize the rotation UI, you can use the hotkey U. With the character's right hand, I'll move the anchor point to the wrist. It's all starting to come together. We'll be able to get a bit of movement in there. We'll pick whip that to the right arm. For the arm, let's put the anchor point up near the shoulder. Now, if we rotate that, we can see that the hand and sword moves with it, which is exactly what we wanted. We'll attach the arm to the shoulder. Let's move the anchor point for the neck as well. And then connect it to the scarf. I'll move the anchor point for the head to a natural rotation point. Then I'll link that to the neck. I'll shift click to grab all of the eye assets and I'll link them to the head as well. And the hair will also be attached to the head. It all follows a certain logic that's difficult to mess up, to be fair. Now let me go back and move the anchor points for the eyes as well. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. And finally, let's attach the hood to the body. And there we go, a fully rigged character ready to be animated. See, if I move the body, everything else goes with it. That's exactly what we want. And with that all done, join me in the next video and we'll start animating this character. Hi and welcome back. Now that our character is fully rigged, we can start the animation process. It's been a long time coming. We're finally here. We're going to get our assassin to idle. So if you go to the body layer and click P, it'll bring up the position slider. And then if you click the stopwatch icon next to it, you'll place a keyframe on the timeline. If your timeline display looks different to mine, you can actually go up to these blue numbers and control left click to change it. You can also drag along the timeline in this section above the layers as well. If your keyframe is selected, you can also copy and paste it with Ctrl C and Ctrl V to the point in your timeline that you have selected. Now, just with this new keyframe selected, we can tap down a couple of times to move our character's position down. You can then select multiple keyframes at the same time by dragging the cursor over them. And we can tweak the easing by right-clicking. Without easing, you get consistent speed in your movement between 2 points. This can look a little robotic though. Easing allows you to get a bit of acceleration and deceleration into the movement, which you could argue is more human. And Easy Ease, which is also F9 on your keyboard, changes your linear keyframe to one that has a little bit of acceleration and deceleration built in. If you scroll back and forth on the timeline between these 2 points, you'll see we get some movement. Now, we're actually going to animate this with code. If we go over to the stopwatch and Alt left click it, we'll get this text box under our keyframes. There's a list of all the different pieces of code that you can select from this little play button. But there's one piece of code in particular that you'll be using throughout this course, so it's better to commit it to memory. And that code is loop out, all one word, with a lowercase l to start, and then an uppercase O, parentheses, which will create two of them. Then you're going to put speech marks. For me, that's Shift and 2 to bring that up. And inside, you'll write ping pong without any spaces. At the end of the other parentheses, I'll put a semicolon. And then, when I click off the layer, we will have a looping animation that goes between our two keyframes, but repeats until the end of the composition. Now, looping is all well and good, but if you don't get your math right on the frame count, when the animation ends, it might be offset and you won't get a natural loop. It's one of the reasons the composition is set to 10 seconds. For me, it's easier to figure out the spacing for these loops. So there we go. Your very first bit of animation on this project. I'm going to readjust the workspace a little to get a better look at my canvas. You can drag the edges of the UI around as you like. Next, we'll tackle the rotation of the arm. Click R to bring up the rotation slider. Let's move along our timeline to 1 second and then back over to the stopwatch to place a keyframe. After that, let's go back to the start of the timeline and move the slider to rotate the arm down. I'm going to select both keyframes and click F9 to ease them. I'm going to drag that second keyframe closer to the start, and I'll copy the start keyframe and paste it at the end of the sequence. I'm not going to use a looping animation on the arm, but I need to make sure that the start rotation position is the same at the end for it to loop as a whole. Now, a lot of the timings are down to a matter of preference. It helps to watch over the animation a couple of times and either tweak it to be quicker or slower. I'm going to copy the second keyframe and then paste it 3 seconds in. I'll progress down the timeline a little bit, and then I'll rotate the arm back down. Again, just watching the pacing of it back and then adjusting accordingly until it feels right. Don't worry about the exact values that I'm using. Just trust your gut a little bit when you're placing these down. Definitely use mine as a reference. But I also want you to learn some creative decision making of your own. I'll copy and paste that last keyframe and drop it further along the timeline. Whilst I'm at it, I'll copy the final keyframe and paste it a little bit before. And I'm just going to watch it back again. And then I'll adjust it so the movement happens faster. Even with easing, it'll still look a little wooden at this stage. And that's because there's a lack of movement in the rest of the asset, and that's fine. We'll fix it. So to sort that out, I'm going to get the shoulder piece to bob up and down a little. With the shoulder layer selected, click P to bring up the position keyframe. I'll click the stopwatch to leave a keyframe. And then I'll scroll to 1 second and tap up a couple of times to set a new keyframe. I'll select them both and hit F9 to ease them, and then we're going to create a looping animation by alt-clicking the stopwatch to bring up the text box. Again, the code is loop out, lowercase l and uppercase O, parentheses, quotation mark, ping pong, all one word, parentheses, semicolon. The sooner that you can commit that to memory, the better. Now, we've got an issue here. When it plays back, we have a bit of a gap showing. So on the second keyframe, let's bring it down slightly. If we wanted to have a more exaggerated movement, we could have created a shape layer to sit underneath the shoulder layer, and that would hide the gap, but I'm going to opt for a little less movement instead. In the meantime, we'll move over the hand and sword layer. With that selected, I'm going to click R to bring up rotation, and I'll leave a keyframe at the start. And then I'll go forward on the timeline and place an additional frame rotating the hand up. Remember, the rotation is going to happen around your pivot point, so you want to make sure it's where the wrist would be. I'll select the keyframes and hit F9 to ease them. And you know what? I'm going to switch these keyframes around. I'm going to leave the rotation one frame off so it's slightly offset from the arm's movement. And with the next set of keyframes, I'm going to drop them in around the time the arm starts moving and ending. You rarely want all of the keyframes 100% in sync with each other. Having frames slightly off by a frame or two can help the movement feel more natural. If something doesn't feel quite right about the movement, you can tweak the parameters so the movement is more subtle or exaggerated. Sometimes it is just a matter of changing the position of the keyframes around themselves. When we get to the third character in this course, I'll teach you a more advanced way of easing with the graph editor, but for the time being, we're going to stick with the basics. Feel free to switch up the positioning of your own keyframes. Remember, the only rule you need to follow is getting the first and last keyframes to match so it loops. Otherwise, feel free to make some of your own creative decisions when it comes to the movement. At the moment, my character moves the blade up and then immediately down, but a little too slowly, so I'm going to add another keyframe so he brings the sword down with more conviction. Now, when the character is idling, there are these subtle off-pose movements that keep the character from being completely still. So in between these two keyframes, I'm going to add a little rotation in the same direction the sword was heading, but I'll keep it light. Likewise, when the sword drops down, I'll add another keyframe between the last two. And then I'll watch the whole sequence back, just to get a better feeling of what's going on in the composition. And typically, the more times that you do this, the more improvements you'll make. Don't be afraid to delete keyframes and replace them if something feels off about the movement to you. It is possible to overdo it with too many keyframes. Again, just trust your gut. And sometimes you'll find you get the offset movement you need from the other layers that you've already set up. And that's the beauty of working digitally. It's all about trial and error. I'm going to grab my character 1R shoulder and just move that above the character 1R arm. Next, I'm going to grab this left shoulder layer and move it above the left arm. So when I rotate the arm, it stays under the fabric of the shoulder. Let's drop a rotation keyframe by clicking the stopwatch and then moving along to 1 second to drop another keyframe where the rotation movement has led the hand down. We'll select them both and ease them with F9. Now, I've noticed a layering issue here. We want the hair, eyes, head, and neck to sit below the arms. So I'm going to select all of those layers with Shift and left click, and then just drag them down so they sit above the scarf layer. Now that'll make sure the hand sits in front. Let's continue to work on the character's left arm. I'm going to switch the current keyframes around so the assassin brings both arms up closer to his chest, making him seem more defensive and wary. Now, there's a couple of ways to drop keyframes down. You can actually click into this little text box, type in the values that you want, and then drop a keyframe. There's also the little diamond in the corner, which I've highlighted, if you wanted to do that instead. I'm just going to get this keyframe to rotate a little more. And then I'll set it back to the previous keyframes value. In my case, that's 11. And then I'll go over here and I'll set this back to 0. Just so you know, if you are putting values in here to go counterclockwise, you put a minus first before your number. But I am just going to make it 0. And as always, you can drag this along anyway. The only issue with dragging across the number is that you can over-exaggerate the movement fairly easily. And sometimes, for idle animations, it's better to go subtle. These are currently way out of sync, so let's watch it back again and make some adjustments. Now, as I'm comparing the movement to the other arm, sometimes with the easing applied to those keyframes, it can be quite difficult to get those in sync. And there is a solution to that. I'm actually going to open the character's right arm layer and tweak that instead. Now there's a trick to bringing up all of the layer's keyframes. You simply click on the layer and then U, and it'll reveal all of the frames in use. I'll drop another frame in here, then just watch that back to make sure that it's fine. Now, another handy thing to know is that you can open multiple layers keyframe information by again clicking on the layer and hitting U on your keyboard. And there you go, you have another visual indicator of how closely in sync your frames are. I'm just going to delete this keyframe. I'll move my final keyframe forward. And as you can see, the offset is a little too far, so I'll pull this frame back. I'll try the offset one frame prior to the arm movement to see how it feels. As always, I'm just watching the whole sequence back. It can be a little bit of a slow process, but the more times you watch it back, the better an understanding you'll have of any issues that are in there. I'll place one more offset keyframe here. And again, just watch it back, make sure everything's fine. And again, I'll place another offset keyframe. Remember to save constantly. Adobe is known to crash, so make sure that you're saving at regular intervals. Just tweak that a little bit. I'm just going to tweak this value here. Again, don't focus on the exact values that I'm using. I want you to become comfortable with the process of doing these things on your own. I'm hoping that by showing you my workflow, that you'll be able to take some of these concepts and apply it in your own way. And you know what? I'm happy with that for the time being. I'm going to go back and tweak the left arm rotation slightly. Tweak this. Add in a slight offset there. You really can get as creative as you like. Go as subtle or aggressive as you want. The only rule that you've got to contend with is that your first and last keyframes must be the same. And then it's just a matter of, is it too fast or too slow, or too subtle or too exaggerated? It's all just about experimentation at the end of the day, placing the frames and then assessing. I'm actually going to get rid of a couple of keyframes towards the end. I like the slow arc down before he gets defensive again, and the start of the loop. It makes it feel like there's a moment of trust before he changes his mind. Now let's animate the hood. With the layers selected, click P to bring up the position slider. We'll put in a couple of keyframes. For this second keyframe, at 1 second in, we want the hood to come down very slightly. And we're going to alt-click the stopwatch and type out the loop out code. And again, I'll make it clear for you, it's loop out with a lowercase l and an uppercase O, parentheses, quotation mark, ping pong, all one word, parentheses, semicolon. We'll do a similar deal with the hair. Altering the position keyframe. This time I'm going to put a bit of a sideways motion in there as well. So while you're sitting at 1 second on your timeline, you can tap the arrows a little to the left and down a couple of times to get that movement. And then I'm just going to grab both of those keyframes, hit F9 to ease them. And then we'll use our favorite looping animation code. And this time, I'm not even going to tell you what it is. Can you remember without looking at the screen? And there you go, we have the core of the character animated. In the next video, we'll get the eyes blinking to bring him to life. And I'll also introduce you to the puppet pin tool so we can finesse this even further. I'll see you in the next one. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we'll be focusing on the window to the soul. But before that, we're going to use the puppet pin tool to get a couple of subtle movements on the hood. So with the hood layer selected, you want to go to the toolbar and travel along until you get to the pin icon. The shortcut is Ctrl and P. You'll have the option to turn the mesh view on or off with this tick box. And now, when we go to our hood and drop a pin, you'll see the mesh appears over our asset. Remember the warp tool in Photoshop from earlier? This is like a more advanced version of that, but it retains keyframe data as well. I'm placing pins at the top and the front of the edges, and then one on either side. I'll place one on the character's right side at the front too, in order to keep the hood anchored so it doesn't drift away. If I click U a couple of times on our hood layer, you'll see that the keyframes eventually all pop up next to each other. Because I had this point selected in the timeline when I started adding pins, it automatically puts keyframe data down in that place. So I'm going to select them all and drag them to the start of the timeline. And I'll paste them at the end as well. And then, about 1 second in, I'll drag the front of the hood further down. I'll paste that keyframe at 9 seconds in as well. With an idle animation like this, there's a lot of back and forth. The keyframes tend to sway. In terms of positioning, I tend to place them around the start and end of other movements already happening. If your playback speed is a little slower than mine, you can always decrease the quality using this window. I'll drag this second to last keyframe back a little. just doing a bunch of fine tweaks and adding another keyframe just before the end. And watching it back one more time. I'm not a fan of the additional bobbing up and down at the end there, so I'm going to revise this section. I'll delete that, bring this further up. And with them all selected, I'll ease them as well. Another thing that I've discovered while working on these kinds of animations is that the whole thing will often look bad for a long while until you get close to the end. So if you're having any doubts at the moment, stick with it. The more time you spend on it, the better it'll turn out. I find myself asking these questions over and over. Is the movement too forced? Is the movement too subtle? What's the intention for the movement? If you're able to define how the character is feeling in that moment, that can very much inform the direction that you choose to go in with your keyframes. Feel free to experiment with more puppet pins. I've found that it can be easily overdone. And if you've not got pins set on the edges, it can distort the image in ways that don't look complementary. My process for this is all about trial and error. Now, with all that sorted, let's move on to the eyes. The way I do them is pretty simplistic. Most of the hard work was done in Photoshop. You can trim layers in After Effects with Alt plus the square brackets, depending whether you want to cut before or after the point in your timeline. You can also zoom in and out of the timeline with this little slider here if you need precision. I'll just reset the cut here with Ctrl and Z. Let's choose our eye open layer and cut it down to 1 second in length. You can also drag the length from the side. Then we'll trim in the reverse direction for the eye mid. I tend to move forward 2 frames and then I'll trim again. I do actually want it to be 2 frames, so I'll drag this back just a little bit. Then do the same with the eye closed layer. I'll then copy the eye mid layer, put it above the eye closed, and just move it along the timeline. If you hold Shift as you move the layers around the timeline, it tends to understand that you want the layers to link up in a consecutive way. I'll then copy and paste the open eye layer. In fact, I'll go back to the start of the timeline and make sure these new copied layers are pick whipped with the main open eye layer. Without that, those new eye layers wouldn't follow the current movement of the character. We don't want that. I'm going to stretch this final layer, maybe to around 4 seconds long. And then, with all of the layers selected, I'll hold Ctrl, Shift and P to group them together in a pre-comp. Now, a pre-comp is essentially its own sequence that sits within the main sequence. It's one way of keeping the timeline organized with less layers. I'll call it Character 1 Eye Blinking. And we'll go to the start of the timeline again and pick whip this new pre-comp to our character's head. If we double click on the pre-comp, you can see inside of it. Let's copy and paste the layers and push them further along so we get a blinking loop. Just copy these again. And then we can open our previous compositions by going to the Sequence tab above the Layer panel. Our character is really starting to come to life now. Join me in the next video where I'll show you how to add some more effects to automate some additional animations on our character. I'll see you then. Hi and welcome back. In this video, I'll be teaching you some of my go-to effects when working on splash screen art animations. But first of all, I'm going to add a quick ping pong loop to our character's head so it bobs up and down slightly. I'm going to hit P to bring up the position keyframe. I'll drop another keyframe at 1 second in. Select them both and ease them with F9. Alt-click the stopwatch and put in our loop out ping pong code. And there we go, we've got a little bit of movement on the head now. And now I'll add a little rotation movement to the head as well. So I'll hit R to bring up rotation, click the stopwatch for the keyframe, go over to 1 second in and drop another. I'm going to send that to -3. And then I'll select them both and F9 to ease them. I'm not going to ping pong loop this. I'm just going to move over to 3 seconds in and move the rotation of the head back to 0. Again, I'm noticing a slight gap here around the hair and the hood. So I'm just tweaking my keyframes ever so slightly so I don't reveal any white space behind. I'll place another frame at 7 seconds in. And then again, 1 second after. And then we just want to make sure that the final keyframe is the same as the start, so it loops. Just watching it back to get an understanding if it works or not. Right, let's show you some effects. So in order to use an effect, you must first navigate over to your effects panel, which you'll find over on your right. There are absolutely loads that you can play around with from the drop-downs, but for the time being, we're going to search for CC Bend It. When the effect appears, you simply left-click it, hold, and then drag it over the layer you'd like to use it on. It might look like it's disappeared, but that's because we need to provide some additional information to the effect that we're using. If you head over to the project window, you'll now see the effect controls next to it. There'll be a little crosshair button next to the start. If you click on that and then hover over your canvas, you'll be able to place an anchor from which your assets will bend from. So I place mine where the cape meets the character's torso. And then click on the crosshair button for end. Then place that in the outer direction of your cape. Now, there might be an instance where part of your asset is still missing. In that case, you can actually drag this new little anchor point further away until everything reappears. The same with the one in the other direction. Now, if we go to bend and toggle the slider, we get a mixture of rotation and warping effects. If we click the stopwatch on bend, then move forward in our timeline and adjust the slider, it'll drop a new keyframe and we'll get the motion. And then go to our layer and click U. The keyframe will reveal in our timeline. I'm going to select and ease them and create a ping pong loop. Again, you know how to do that by now. Alt left click on the stopwatch and then type in the loop out ping pong code in the little text box. I'm just going to watch this back so I can see how it plays. I'm going to open the cape layers keyframes with U. I'm actually going to bring back that cape animation so it loops at 1 second rather than 2. I'll bring up the rotation keyframe with R. And I'm going to do a slight bit of rotation on the cape as well. I'll select them both and ease them with F9. Alt-click the stopwatch and enter our favorite ping pong loop. And then just add a slight offset. I'll go a little bit further. Just play it back a couple of times to get a better understanding of the movement. And I'll adjust this bend movement ever so slightly too. Finally, I'll add a wave warp effect as well. We can get that by heading back over to our effects panel on the right and typing that in. Dragging it over onto our cape layer. In here, we have a bunch of parameters. The effect will oscillate an asset based on a waveform, in this case, a sine wave, which is perfect for fabric and hair. Although we don't want the movement to be too extreme. So I'm going to make the wave height very small. I've got -4 there, but you could put 4 and it'd be the same. Then I'll put the wave width to 100. If we watch the animation back, you'll see the textures flutter in the wind. I'm just going to tweak the values on CC Bend It so it's a little less extreme. And then let's do the same process on the other two sections of the cape. Again, using CC Bend It and then placing the start and end anchors on our canvas. Just grabbing the crosshairs. I'll click the stopwatch to drop a keyframe on the timeline, then in the layer panel, I'll click U to reveal it. Now, if I want to bring up multiple layer values at a time, I can hold Shift and click R, which keeps the bend keyframes revealed, but also makes the rotation value available too. Without holding Shift, if I clicked R, the rotation would appear and the bend it would vanish. So if you want multiple things, always hold Shift. I'll add a rotation keyframe here too, move forward 1 second of the timeline, and drop in the bend movement. I want the rotation to head in the same direction as the bend. I'll ease them, and then I'll create a ping pong loop. I can actually copy this line of code and then just paste it into our rotation text box. I'll create the offset by just pushing those two keyframes back ever so slightly. And you know what? I'm going to push this one back as well. If you do that, just remember to drag it back out at the other side. We can actually copy the wave warp effect from the other cape layer as well. So let's Control-C on the wave warp on our other cape and then paste it onto our new cape layer. I'm just going to move that wave warp effect above the CC Bend It effect. You can run into a couple of little layering bugs when it comes to your effects chain. If ever one of your effects isn't working how you expect it to, you can always move it up and down in the effects panel, and sometimes that'll fix the issue. Let's repeat that process one more time for the final layer, dragging CC Bend It onto our cape, putting the start crosshair down, followed by the end crosshair. We'll set our bend keyframe and our rotation keyframe as well. I'll just toggle the bend so it goes up slightly, and I'll get the rotation to follow in the same direction. I'll grab all of that and easy ease. I'll alt-click the bend stopwatch and put in our loop out ping pong code. I'll copy and paste that code and put it into the rotation. And then I'm just going to push back the rotation frames a little bit more. I'll play around with the offset by moving the keyframes further forward. And because we have that looping code set, it will loop between those positions even if those frames are off the visible timeline. I'm just going to copy our wave warp effect, and I'm going to move it up above the CC Bend It effect. Now, I'm going to use the wave warp effect on our foreground layers as well. So I'll copy and paste my wave warp. I'll paste it on the left foreground and the right foreground. But I'll increase our wave width to 200 so it's even wider. The wave warp effect can cause the inside borders of your asset to reveal gaps, so I tend to increase the scale just a little bit. I'm just going to move the anchor points of both sides so that when I scale, they'll scale from the edges. With both layers selected, I can hit S to bring up those parameters, and then I can type in 105 to increase the scale on both. Now, I'm not a particular fan of them all moving in sync, so I'm going to duplicate the side on the left and mask around the top. Not too dissimilar to how we did the cape earlier. Then I'll mask the lower section of the original copy, and then I'll change the wave direction so it's a little different to the top layer, and I'll take that wave height to -2. I want to link the copied foreground layer to the original one, so I'll pick whip it, and I'm going to repeat the process on the opposite foreground layers now. Again, duplicating the layer, creating a mask at the top and the bottom, I'll change the wave height to -2, and I'll change the direction so it points to northwest. Those are our character animations complete. In the next video, I'll show you how we can animate the background as well as give our composition some dynamic lighting. I'll see you in the next one. Hi and welcome back. In this video, I'll show you how to animate the background using the depth map that we created earlier, and I'll also teach you how to create volumetric lighting as well. So let's get to it. Right-click within an empty space in the Layers panel, go to New and then Adjustment Layer. We can place effects on the adjustment layer and it will apply to everything underneath it. First off, let's grab the tint effect from the Effects panel on the right, and we'll drag that onto our adjustment layer, which will make everything black and white. Next, we'll grab the Curves effect and drag that onto our layer as well. With the Curves effect, we can pull down on the bottom left-hand side of the square in order to increase the darker values. Then, we'll look for the CC Radial Fast Blur effect and drop that on our adjustment layer as well. I'm going to increase the amount to around 93 so we start getting these rays of light appearing. I'll tweak the darker values on the Curves effects very slightly, and then I'll continue to finesse it just a little bit more. And then, if we navigate down to the layer panel on our new adjustment layer, if we click this little box that says normal, we want to search for screen. Now, I don't want my whole composition affected by this, so I'm actually going to move this layer underneath our character so it only affects the background. I'll continue to tweak the settings until I get something that feels right. I noticed that in a lot of tutorials, the teacher tends to give exact numbers for everything. It really is subjective though. And I'd always encourage you to play around with the settings yourself. I feel like this backlight helps separate the character and gives the whole image more depth, which is exactly what I'm after. I'm also going to animate the background with a parallax effect. This will give the foreground, midground, and background a little more depth. Best practice is to grab a Gaussian blur from the effect panel and then drop that on our depth map layer. As a rule of thumb, I tend to set this to either 50 or 100 or 200 and test between these values to see how it affects the motion in the background later. With the depth map layer selected, I'll convert that into its own pre-comp by clicking Ctrl Shift and C. I'm going to select this second checkbox, which will keep all the adjustments attached to the layer as it becomes its own sequence. I'll call that Depth Map. I'll then create a new adjustment layer, and I will grab a displacement map effect and drop that onto the new adjustment layer as well. Now, in this first drop-down box, I'll select our depth map pre-comp. I'll also change the next two drop-down boxes to luminance, And then in fourth, I'll set it to stretch map to fit. I'll toggle warp pixels around to on. And then finally, I'll toggle the visibility on the pre-comp depth map layer to off. Now, when I go back to the adjustment layer and adjust the slider of the horizontal displacement, my background will move. I'm going to drop a keyframe at the start and then place one in the middle. Don't forget to ease them with F9 so the transition between the movement is smooth. Then I'll copy the starting keyframe as well and paste it at the end. And finally, I'll move the foreground elements as well with the position keyframes. I did actually get lost here for a moment as I was deciding how I wanted the foreground elements to move. Eventually, what I settled on was having both of the foreground elements moving in the same direction from side to side. So the only thing to mention, if you wanted to do a similar effect, is to make sure that your starting keyframes are exactly the same as your final keyframes. And then in your midsection, you want to have nudged that either to the left or right. The issue that I kept coming up against was nudging the elements too far and causing a gap on the side. So just be mindful of that if you're going to do the same. I'm not the biggest fan of this orange strip down the left-hand side, so I'm going to scale the background a little. But before I do that, I want to make sure that the depth map pre-comp is linked to it, so that'll scale with it as well. There we go, much better. We're very nearly done. In the next video, we'll add some finishing touches to our animation. I'll see you then. Hi and welcome back. We really are wrapping up on this first character animation. If you look at the resources available with this chapter, you'll see that I've attached some stock elements for you. You'll need those to continue, so do me a favor and get those downloaded. I'm going to drag everything bar the light leak in and drop them in my extras folder. First, I'm going to drag this rain loop into our composition. You'll notice it's black and that's how it's supposed to look, so don't worry. We'll go to our layers panel and in this first drop down, we're going to open that menu and look for screen. This will get rid of the black part of the video. Now if we hit play, you'll see you get this rain animation playing over the top. I'm going to bring the opacity down to 25% and I'll do that by clicking on the layer and clicking T for transparency. We'll do the same with the particles. I'm going to put that layer underneath my character. And then finally, we're going to add a little bit of fog, which I'll bring down to 25% opacity as well. There are dozens of places that you can get stock assets from online, like Envato Market or Pexels. You can get creative and make your own using After Effects plugins or even AI softwares like Gen 2. That's how I got my rain. Next, I'll create another adjustment layer to sit over everything. I'll be using this layer to apply a color grade. In the effects panel, grab Volumetric color and drop that over the new adjustment layer. This is the core color grading tool in Premiere and After Effects. The temperature will shift between orange and blue, tint green and purple. The saturation will either mute the colors or embolden them. Contrast will deepen the lighter and darker values. There's all sorts you can play around with. For our composition though, I'm going to make it a little colder, so bringing the temperature down and then adding a little bit more contrast. In the creative dropdown, you have even more options. I find myself using faded film and vibrance more than anything else. Vibrance is similar to saturation but intensifies the colors. I'll continue to tweak some values until I find something that feels right to me. Again, it's very subjective. But there is a logic. The rain implies that the environment should be a little colder, therefore shifting things towards blue makes sense. I'm happy with this. So now is on to exporting it so you can show it off on social media or even add it to your showreel. Head up to File, Export, add to Adobe Media Encoder, wait for that to load. You can edit the formatting details by clicking on the first blue text. If your format isn't H.264, you can change it here. If you click here, you can change the name of the file and where it saves as well. Now, the most important setting is under bitrate, and this pretty much dictates the overall quality of your render. I set mine to CBR with a target bitrate of 40 megabytes. I toggle on Use Maximum Render Quality, and then hit OK and hope that Adobe doesn't crash. If you are having issues, you can try setting the target bitrate to VBR2 pass. If you're still having issues with the export, sometimes it's easier to export as a QuickTime file instead. Creativity is just problem solving, and it's not uncommon for Adobe to throw those problems at you, so just be prepared. And there you go, the first animation is done. Thank you so much for sticking with me, and I hope this was easy enough for you to follow, and I really hope that you've managed to make something that you're proud of. Now that you've got the basics and the wraps, the next two should be extremely easy to get into, but I am still going to show you a couple of new techniques along the way. Okay, I hope to see you in those videos. But for now, just celebrate getting this one done, because it's been a long process, and it's a big achievement. Hi, and congratulations for making it this far, opening up After Effects for the first time. It can be absolutely terrifying. I remember the first time that I did it, I loaded up the software, I saw all of these complicated menus, at least they felt complicated at the time, and I turned it off. I didn't come back to it for at least 2 or 3 years, and that's not even a joke. So if you've made it this far, massive congratulations, it's a huge achievement. Well, you'll now have a taste for the workflow, and some of you might want to steam ahead to animating the different characters that I have down in the bonus section. And to be fair, I'd encourage you to do that. Keeping motivation through any course can be a challenge. And I understand when you're just feeling inspired and you have that energy and you want to just crack on and just push forward with stuff. Yeah, if you do feel massively inspired and you're feeling very confident, feel free to have a bit of a go on those characters yourself before continuing. Otherwise, if you still want to build your confidence and, really nail down the workflow, and you're also interested in learning these additional techniques that I've got, then I would recommend that you stick with me into the next section where we'll be animating this character.